All right, everyone, we are back for something special. Age of Fantasy Regiments has been a game that I played a lot for one page rules, but I think from the start, and this goes back sort of to pre 3.0 regiments, we sort of played, me and my friends over there, primarily Sam, but a couple of others, we played one game of sort of the base rules. Now, this was before or even 3.0 came out, and we found that the rules movement wise were very clunky here. And so I would say this for the start, for a long time we have been playing Age of Fantasy Regiments, but sort of from the get go, we've always sort of played our own version of it, which is sort of bringing in things. It brings in some stuff, a lot of stuff from 8th edition Warhammer. So both of us, and that's something to keep in mind when my people like my Sam and some of our other gaming groups and myself, we were big Warhammer fantasy players. 8th edition was obviously very heavy influential on us. When 8th edition went away, we switched over to Kings of War. And so we've taken sort of these two different games as well as just earlier editions, as well as Warhammer: The Old World. And what we've done here is that as we started playing Age of Fantasy Regiments, we found it was just much simpler to incorporate sort of our versions of what Warhammer, especially what Warhammer did. And instead of trying to use the Age of Fantasy Regiment's official rules. Now, I would say this: I do. I've actually modified these rules recently with 3.4. I think 3.4 has done a lot to help. I think the game is better, although I think that myself and Sam, and especially, so we're the two designers. I think myself and Sam, who's been on the channel before, we took a lot of time and we would play games. So this is coming from a place that number one, that's how we've played the game, and number two, it's just our own flavor. I don't really consider this version to be its own separate game. It's sort of like our own personal take on Age of Fantasy Regiments. And that's why when I'm presenting this, I'm really just sort of presenting the 3.4.1 rules and just sort of making our tweaks to them. So, like I said, we don't even consider this to be a separate game. It's just sort of our own twist in Age of Fantasy Regiments here. And so when I go through this, I want to sort of talk through some of the things that we've done. I do know that 3.4 in the advanced rules, they actually did add in something called like massive battles, which do something similar, although it's still not quite sort of what we wanted. So we've sort of said, hey, 3.4 Age of Fantasy Regiments is better, but we still like sort of like our own version of it. So with that in mind, take it and play it. We're still sort of in the playtest phase. Like, to be clear, we've only sort of played certain armies. So we haven't played every single army. We don't know as far as if this is maybe balanced from, we basically played generally about like 5 or 6 different armies. Things like dwarves, chivalrous kingdoms. We played lizardmen, high elves, havoc warriors, and I think a couple more dark elves and orcs. So we've played several armies, because we basically have our own units, and then we use some different models as well for proxy. So we've played, like I said, me and Sam's experience playing our own version of Age of Fantasy Regiments is skewed to, I'll say, with smaller subset of armies. So I always want to give a caveat that I don't know that these rules, I'm not going to go out here and say these rules have been balanced for every single army in the game. Especially when it comes to demons, and we'll talk about what sort of we've thought to do as far as a quick fix for demons. But I think we've sort of come to the opinion that demons probably shouldn't have the demon rule, and they should just sort of do what they did in Warhammer 8th Edition and just sort of set up like every other army. All right, so let's just run through these rules. Like I said, take these rules, tweak them. If you like them, great. If not, hey, change your own thing. We're going to sort of, I do want to start playing some more Age of Fantasy Regiments this year. Last year was a lot about Grimdark Future, and I spent a lot of my time focused on testing Grimdark Future, doing custom armies. So with this year, I do want to start focusing on a few of the things. I'm still going to be playing Grimdark Future, but I do want to start getting back into some Age of Fantasy Regiments. So with that in mind, let's sort of talk about sort of our addendums to them. So you can see, as I'm going to go through these pages, I'm going to talk about the rules, and then I'm going to switch into universal battles, and I'll cover some actual cases of what we mean here. So I'm just going to read it. Whenever I come through these pages, we've basically blacked out some different sections, and then we've basically the section that I've blacked out is the section that effectively the rules in blue are overriding. So the one thing we keep in mind is that this is a mass battle version of Age of Fantasy Regiments. It's meant for basically games, I think, at a minimum of 3,000. We've generally found that about 4 to 6,000 is sort of a really nice spot to be, and so keep that in mind when we built these rules. We've built these rules for higher point games, whereas like as you even see here, Age of Fantasy Regiments is sort of meant for 1,500. So sort of keep that in mind. The context of these rules are meant for larger point games. I would say a minimum of 3,000, but generally like 4 to 6,000. We've played 6,000 points with this, and it works really well. So with that, let's cover our versions of what regiments. It says this, basically, it's very similar to the base rules, where it basically says every 5 models in a unit. What we do is we're basically using things called stands, so that to simulate the mass battle aspect, units are presented as base stands. For every 5 models in a unit, a base stand is used. Units with tough 3 are 3 models per stand. So if any of you are very familiar with this is sort of what the existing Age of Fantasy Regiments does. The difference is that we don't. One of the things that we really liked about games like Kings of War is not having to remove individual models. We really liked the idea of setting up basically big stands, whether it's individual stands or in bigger combined unit stands, and just as units die, they get removed away. It's sort of we really liked those rules because it keeps the game a lot cleaner. You're not having to remove individual models. So for us, we focus on the stand. There is no longer like individual models here. The other thing is that in our version, we allow players to combine up to 4 copies of the same unit. So as you know, normal Age of Fantasy Regiments rules, you can combine them in only 2. But so for us, it's the same thing. You just scale up to 4. The other thing that we have in this, in our version, is what we call the Horde formation. Again, this is sort of similar to 8th edition, Warhammer 8th edition, where you have sort of this Horde formation. And what it says here is that we require you to have 4 copies, and that's just because one of the things we do, we want to really simplify things. This game down. We don't want all sort of the unique. We don't want like everyone having their own different versions of the ranks. It's either 5 or 10. And then the Horde formation, if you start out with 4 copies, you basically can have 2 stands as a rank formed side by side. And the unit's formation, the other thing is we say the unit's formation can't be changed after being deployed. So while we like these ideas of bigger hordes, when we play things like Warhammer the Old World, and even some things like Warhammer, 8th editions, and the reforming units and all that, really, it just makes the game a lot more clunkier. So while I think we do, in our version, we give a player an option to basically choose how they're going to set up in that formation before the battle. But once that unit's been deployed, it's sort of win it. So we go into some examples here. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and switch out to Universal Battles to talk about it. But basically, it's the idea that, like I said, 4 copies of a 10-man unit would be theoretically 40 models. And so what it would mean, it would be like 2 5-man stands across and 4 ranks deep. Or you can have 1 5-man stand and go 8 ranks deep. And basically, I'll show you when we switch to Universal Battle, there's basically pros to cons to both. If you go 10-man wide on these bigger units, you're obviously going to be able to get more attacks on those first 2 ranks. But you also open yourself up to being hit by multiple units yourself. Whereas if you stick to sort of a single, it's sort of like old Warhammer 8th edition, right? Having those deeper ranks means you get that rank bonus as well. Although, like I said, we don't have anything like Steadfast in this game. And then the other thing you can do is you can take 2 5-man units, so that's 20 models. Again, you could form these 20-man units into either 2 ranks of 10, so 10 wide and then 2 ranks deep, or 5 wide and then 4 ranks deep. And then for tough 3 units, the same thing. They can either go basically 2 ranks, and that those tough 3 units at sort of this horde formation is a lot of attacks, but it's always sort of balanced by the fact that those guys are only going to hit 1 unit. And it's also, as you're going to see, some of these units, when you do run them 10 deep, or if, for instance, in tough 3 units, 6 deep, that's a big footprint. So these units do become pretty clunky. One of the things that we note in here that we really, one of the reasons we did this is that you don't actually have to have the number of models per stand. So if you wanted to create more like dioramas, or if you just wanted to have like maybe just use, it's a great, we like this because it allows the game to be a lot more accessible. Since you aren't counting individual models, it means that you don't have to have 40 or 12 or 20 each. You can sort of have your stands and maybe have less models mixed in there. The other thing we talk about is your stand sizes. So one of the things we want this game to be able to do, we want it to be able to play at different scales. So whether it's 25 millimeter or 10 millimeter for your, basically the idea is that we tried to build the game so that it's flexible enough to be played at 10 mil scale, and that the rules would function very similarly. Maybe you would half range for everything, but really it's just, since it's all based on the stands, the rules should be able to translate pretty well at different scales, 10 mil scale, 25 mil scale, and other scales. The idea is that whatever stand sizes you're using, just whatever your group is using, just sort of be consistent. So let's switch over to Universal Battles. I'm going to give you some of these examples just so you can see them to make sure you understand what's going on. All right, I've pulled up Universal Battles here, and so one of the things that I have here is I have an infantry formation that is so again, this is the 40 mans. Obviously, 10 and 20 man units are going to be relatively straightforward. But for the 40s, I just want to show you what I mean. So here we have some infantry. These are 40, right? So this is basically a total of 40 stands. So this would be, this would be a total of 8 stands that you can either run them as a horde, again, run them 10 wide and then 4 deep, or you can run them 5 wide and 8 deep. And as you can see here, there's pros and cons. And I also have this for cavalry as well. Running cavalry, again, you get less attacks as you come in, but you have those extra ranks. Whereas here, if you ran your cavalry, if you ran them 10 wide, you're going to get a lot of attacks, but you're also going to open yourself up to a lot more counterattacks. And then even here, so here is, I have some Pegasus Knights, and you can run these guys 4 deep and just 3 wide, but it's only these first 2 ranks are attacking. But then again, if you run them, 6 wide, that's a very large footprint. So it is a bit more clunky because you're going to have a harder time maneuvering. And the other thing is, again, it opens this unit up to more attacks. You can have a unit hit this side and then hit the other side. And basically, because of the fatigue, it works out really well. So this is just sort of showing you 2 examples at sort of this larger scale about how like infantry, cavalry, and like what we call tough 3 units, in this sense, Pegasus Knights would sort of work. So let's continue on. Let's go on to the next page. All right, so the next thing we're going to cover here is shooting. We've really expanded. We're going to cover movement, and then we're going to cover shooting. Now, as you can see here, the movement... One thing we found in Age of Fantasy Regiments, even in 3.4.1, is that there is a lot of room for interpretation in movement. What we have done is we've always sort of played it this way. So our movement rules are different, and our movement is more restrictive, and we'll talk about why our movement rules are more restrictive, because flanks and rear charges are a lot more punishing in the way we play the game. So we do have to restrict movement, and that also means restricting... again, this just sort of feels like a traditional rank and flank game. So one thing we did is we did ease the restriction. Excuse me. You do have to stay outside of 1 inch for enemies, but we do allow you to get within 1 inch for friendly units. And that's because, again, we're playing at a larger scale. We're playing at 4,000 to 6,000 points. So we are trying to give people some room to position their units a little closer together from a friendly perspective. So again, that's the context of this. That's why we've loosened up this so that you can be within 1 inch. We just say, like I said, just make sure there's a little space in between the stands so that your opponent knows, where the units start. The other thing we have is we've changed the movement. So again, our movement rules are a lot more restrictive. A hold, if you're going to hold, you cannot move or pivot. And this is actually where we feel that war machines in Age of Fantasy regiments and shooting can be a little too strong, especially war machines, that there's basically no point in having things like indirect. So one of the things that we do is, since we are relying a lot more on our arcs in Age of Fantasy regiments, we are saying that if you're going to hold, you can't pivot or move. So that's a change we did. We then go into the advanced movement. Now, there are some slight changes that what we did, but this is very similar to the existing rules where, one, when you advance, you can choose to not move. So if you choose not to move, then you can pivot up to 180 degrees. If you do move, you can pivot once up to 90 degrees at any point during the movement. Or you can choose to move in any direction, half your move, but you can't pivot. So basically, you have to keep the same facing. So the advance movement are very similar to the existing rules. For the rush, one thing we did is, again, we've restricted that movement. You can't pivot during your rush. Now, this, like I said, this is different than what's going on in Age of Fantasy Regiments, where you actually have that ability to pivot. In our version of this game, movement is more restrictive. So if you're going to rush, you can't pivot. You just have to move straight forward. For a charge, so one thing we did with charges is not only did we change them, but we also have provided some clarity in how we interpret a charge move should be. So I would say this. Part of this is our changing the rules. Part of this is also our own interpretation of how a charge should go. So let's get into it. So a charge can only target enemies in the unit's front 45-degree arc. And the other thing, this is a big change that we've changed. You have to have line of sight with one of the models in the front rank. Now, this is actually a big change. Current OPR, in general, you don't have to have line of sight to charge. We felt by not allowing line of sight, it actually makes, especially in regiments, it makes flyers very powerful in regiments. Now, in normal Age of Fantasy, flyers aren't quite as bad. But when you have things like flanks, when you have things, there's a lot of things that flyers can do that we've just sort of found that flyers are too powerful in regiments. So one of the ways we limit that is we actually require models to have line of sight. So that means a flying unit can't charge a unit that's maybe on the other side of a hill. We do say that you can pivot once at any point during movement here. So that is very similar. The big thing that we've changed in a charge for Age of Fantasy Regiments is that you have to have line of sight. In our version of this game, we find that especially with flyers and things like Fast and Strider, but flyers is a big deal. We do require those flyers to have line of sight. So here's another thing that we talk about. And this goes back to 8th edition. When charging a unit may actually go over 12 inches plus, any ability terrain modifiers during its actual move. And I'm going to show you this. One of the things that we didn't like about Warhammer the Old World, we don't like paying for charges. We have found that the charging system should just be a lot simpler, where if you're in charge range and you can get there with one pivot, so you must be within charge range at the beginning of the charge, and you can make contact with only one pivot. So, same thing that so in other words, you may actually be able to go through more than that. That's fine. We talk about pivoting. So one of the things, and this goes back to Kings of War that we really liked. In this game, we have found that basically you are allowed to pivot through units and blocking terrain as long as you're able to complete the pivot. Pivoting still counts as moving through difficult and dangerous terrain. So one of the things that you can't do, even though you can technically pivot through blocking terrain or pivot even through other units, if you are, so we allow, and that's something that it's a simplification that we liked in Kings of War. We liked the idea of just making the units have a little more wiggle room when it comes, otherwise the game can stall really fast. So we do allow people to pivot through blocking terrain and units, although they basically can't end up midway. They have to be able to what we call complete the pivot. But if they're going to pivot through difficult and dangerous terrain, hey, that still counts as moving through them. All right, so here, let's go through how we sort of walk through a charge. And this is sort of our own version, our clarification. So this is how we do it. The first thing we do is to determine flanks. So this, again, determine the facing that the charging unit attacks. So the first thing we do is we're going to place a 45-degree arc on the defender's basically corner. we're then going to use that 45-degree arc to find out where the majority of the attacker's front rank lies. This is basically, very similar to 8th edition. The attacker charges that facing. Now, this is another thing that we've changed, and this is, again, goes back for flyers. The attacker can't charge a facing, can't charge that. If an attacker can't charge that facing, then it can't charge the unit. So, and I'll show you, there's actually some really good corner cases where flyers, if we don't have this point in, a flyer can say, "Oh, I can't charge your front rank, but I can charge your I can't charge your front facing, but I can charge your flank just by flying over things." So we actually stop a lot of that. Again, we have found that flyers and regiments is just way powerful. So one of the things we do is we say if you can't charge the facing, then you can't charge the unit. We also have some things about a corner case, and this is going back to it. There are, since you have these units, there could possibly be situations where multiple defending units block an attacker from charging any of them. What we talk about is it's perfectly viable to put units in front of others. So one thing we say is that this isn't talking about chaffing up a unit. This isn't talking about putting a chaff unit in front of the unit you want to protect. This is about basically sort of gaming the system where you stop a unit from charging anything. So if that ever happens, we say the defending unit must be able to charge one unit. If the attacker cannot successfully move into contact with any defender, then what we do is you move the attacking unit as close as possible, and then the attacking player is going to pick one of the units to charge. And basically what you do is you just move that defending unit in contact and you continue your melee as normal. And that's sort of to stop some of the gaminess that can happen, where one thing we don't think it's fair that a defender can basically use their units in ways to stop someone from charging anything. Now, terrain is different. As long as the attacker can charge one unit, this corner case doesn't go into play. Let's go back into Universal Battles and let's sort of walk through some of these things going on. All right, so here we're in Universal Battles here. So here I've got a cav unit. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pivot them a little bit here. And then here I'm just going to measure. And I'm going to back them up so that they're just in 16. So let's just back them up. So again, these guys are a 12-inch move plus they have fast. So they would have a 16-inch charge range, basically, right? Again, because it's 12 inches plus the modifiers. Well, fast is a modifier, so they have to be it. So as you can see here, if we measure tip to tip, these guys would be in charge range. Now, what we do is that we don't... This is where Warhammer the Old World we really don't like. Where Warhammer the Old World, you actually have to, like, literally measure. In other words, this unit, if this unit actually goes more than 16 inches, it can't make it. What we say is that there is going to be... So, like in this case, 16 inches. But actually, to make the charge, suppose this unit has to pivot and then charge. Well, now it's 17 inches. So in other words, what we don't want to do is we don't want a person to have to, like, this is basically for ease of the game. This is where Warhammer 8th edition, we feel got it right, and where we feel like Warhammer the Old World, with like paying for pivots is really a problem. Of course, you can pivot either way. With our version, it doesn't matter how you pivot. So you can pivot off the center, or you can pivot, you can pivot on the corners. So for us, it matters, as long as the way you pivot is consistent, it doesn't matter. So in this case, again, because we've already measured it, if they pivot this way and then they go in, it's fine, right? So again, that is a nice way that we simplify the charge moves. So that, in other words, a unit can go past. Now, I want to talk about some of these instances. I have some flyers here, and I actually want to talk about some of the reasons we've put some of these other examples in. Let's suppose that you've got, so I'm just going to back off these cav here, and I'm going to show you some of the problems that we have some of these rules, and it's because they're flyers. So remember, these are Pegasus Knights, they fly. Let's imagine, though, that you've got these Peg Knights here. And let's imagine, actually, that you've got a unit in front. So maybe you're trying to protect this unit with the unit in front of them. So this unit's right here. Well, in current rules, what we do, the reason we do this is we say those Pegasus Knights, we don't want them to be able to just go, oh, I can't charge your front facing, but you know what, your flank facing is here. So they could just go this way and then pivot and then turn, and then they could hit. Then it's like a free flank charge, right? There's a reason that we limit, and that's the reason we have these things. Flyers in this particular game, without our ruling that says you can only charge the facing you're facing. So basically, these Pegasus Knights are in the front facing of these infantry. So that's the only flank they can charge, right? And if you don't do that, then you can have Pegasus Knights. Like, suppose it's this way. Suppose you have a unit here. The Pegasus Knights could just basically go, oh, I'm going to, fly here. I would say this, if having this rule protects and it stops a lot of shenanigans from happening here. All right, so let's talk about how you actually find out who is on the flank. So I talked about this in the rules, but we're going to just cover it in our example here. So suppose these Pegasus Knights, they are here. And we don't know, well, so here these Pegasus Knights, they want to charge these infantry. Well, you ask yourself, well, what are these Pegasus Knights? Would they charge them on the front or in the flank, right? They can see both. So the way we do it is, similar to Warhammer 8th edition, you go to the unit itself. And then here you see you've got this 45-degree arc. And in this 45-degree arc, you can see that the majority of the unit is actually in the flank, right? So you can see here, this little bit's in the front, but here's the flank here. So this is actually similar to what Warhammer 8th edition does or what 9th Age does, where they basically use the majority of the unit to determine here. So in this particular case, since the majority of the unit is in the 45-degree arc of the flank, this would be a flank charge. And what would happen here is they would fly here, they would pivot, and then they would, get their pivot in, and they would hit this unit. And then they would basically align as well. A lot of this stuff is pretty straightforward. So that's how we determine charge arcs and what facing you're going to charge, and whether a unit has a front charge or a flank charge or even like a rear charge. All right, so hopefully that's going to help you sort of understand how we some of the rationale about, in other words, we didn't come up with some of these rules just out of nowhere. We sort of played some games and like, oh yeah, we need to change this rule because it sort of makes, especially flyers, really broken. All right, so let's continue on and get into shooting. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is shooting. Shooting, one of the things that we go back to is that we don't, one of the things about Age of Fantasy Regiments, and this goes back to sort of our experience with Kings of War, we really like the idea of not having to remove individual models. It's, especially when you want to play larger points, can really slow the game down. So what we do is we provide two different ways that you can remove units. So first of all, we say stands in the first two ranks that are in line of sight of an enemy unit that are in their front arc can fire all ranged weapons, again, up to two at two different weapon types, two different units with two different weapon types. Shooting models, again, take a quality, so this is very similar. They take a quality test, afterwards there's a defense value. Here's where it changes. For each wound, the defender must add a wound counter. So one thing's, again, when the defender takes a wound, they don't remove a model. What we do is they have a wound counter. And how you remove units there's basically two different ways you do it. One, you can remove them by stands. So you can choose one of them. You can either choose to remove individual stands as wounds accumulate, or you can remove just the whole unit. So what we do is for removing stands, for every 5 wound counters, remove a stand from the back of the unit, and you remove 5 wound counters. So it's basically, for regular units, for tough 3 units, stands, it's going to be 9 wounds. So for every 5 wounds, you just grab a stand from the back rank, and you just remove it. For tough 3 units, it's going to be 9 wound counters. So that's one way you can do it. It makes the battle go a lot faster, because you just have wound counters on things. Once they reach a certain threshold, whether 5 or 9, you just remove a stand. The other way you could do it is actually even simpler, and that is you just remove the unit as a whole. So what you do is that every 5 wound counters, what we do is we say basically a stand is disabled. So this means that the stand stays the same, the footprint stays, but basically basically that stand can't attack. It remains with the unit. We also say that like tough 3 stands require 9 counters to, quote, be disabled. And basically it's the same thing. When the total number of wound counters equals the total number of wounds for all models in the unit, that's not including the heroes, what happens? You remove the unit. We then, if a unit has a hero, you place that unit in the center of the front rank with the same direction. So basically facing the same direction as the unit here. So this way is actually even simpler, right? The moment now again, a unit can still be broken by morale. So again, if a unit reaches, if it's a 20-man unit and they lose 10 guys, if they fail a morale check, they're still gone. You remove the entire unit as a whole. So I do want to clarify that. Morale still works the same. But, in other words, if you actually want to kill entire units by killing them to the man, you basically do this by removing stands or removing the unit as a whole. It makes things a lot simpler. It allows you to play large-scale games. You could also, again, play these at 10 mil, and it's just, no one wants to remove 10 millimeter guys, right? It's just helping you out a lot. Let's get into melee. So there's a few things we've changed about melee. We've incorporated several things. One, from Warhammer 8th Edition. We've also pulled in some rules from Warhammer the Old World. Or also, there's a few other historical games which do the pushback mechanic as well that we like as well. So like I said, we're pulling from several games. So what we do is we say, for melee, charging units must move into base contact with the target or as close as possible. So again, there's going to be times that maybe there's like a fence in the way. Well, basically, just to sort of, if they can make it in range, then they're just fighting over the fence. We then shuffle to maximize contact, and then the defenders do the same. Models in the first two ranks, so this is, and when we say models, we mean stands. Stands in the first two ranks must strike with all melee weapons in their front facing. And again, it's just like shooting. Then the defender in the front rank may choose to strike back. So again, if you're in the flank or rear, you don't get to attack. Once both units are done, the losing unit must take a morale check. And then we'll talk about morales. Morales basically work the same, but there's a few things. One, if one of the units is destroyed, the survivors may either pivot up to 180 degrees, or they can move 3 inches in any direction but not pivot. This is the other thing we've changed that we've pulled in from recently the Old World, but like I said, historical games as well. We say this. If the winner won by more than 5 melee results, but the loser passed their morale still, the loser still has to move directly back 6 inches if possible. And the winner may advance by up to 6 inches forward. So this is sort of this push mechanic that we've really liked in Warhammer the Old World, where even if you lose combat and you pass your morale, you're sort of pushing that unit, right? You're sort of pushing the line. Otherwise, the loser must move directly 3 inches. So again, if you win by a lot, you push them 6 inches. If not, by maybe 1 or 2, you just push them back 3 inches. And then we say this is the same in the rules. If a combat's a draw, the attacker move back 1 inches. Now, the one thing we have is different here, and this is actually to fix something that happens in regiments that we feel is important. After everything has happened. So basically, suppose you have a Pegasus Knights or whoever charges the flank of a unit. Well, suppose after everything that unit survives, and maybe they get pushed back or whatever, what we say here is actually that unit that survived, the defending unit's owner may afterwards basically rotate it and place it so that its front rank is facing the attacker if possible. And then, maximize. This is basically allowing people to countercharge. So in other words, a flank charge is already brutal enough. Because we have the 45-degree arcs, what we basically say is that we give the defender a chance to get the free move of basically showing that the unit is just going to basically, if they want to, sort of reposition and sort of face their attackers. So that way we can allow on maybe the defending player's turn them to charge those attackers. So again, we don't want flanks to be that punishing. Now we do, this is something that's very different, but we really liked it. Flank and rear charges. We have tried a lot of different things to buff up flank and rear charges. Nothing has worked. So we've basically went down to doubling their attacks in the flank or tripling their attacks in the rear. This comes from Kings of War, and we actually for a while didn't play this rule. So there was times we would try +1 AP. There was a time we were trying the -1 morale. Nothing really felt. One thing we found in this game, flank and rear charges just didn't feel that powerful. Even though it's basically an auto loss, there were so many units that were quality 3, basically quality 2 with a standard, and they had fearless, that they just didn't care about flank and rear charges. It's yeah, you're going to hit me in my flank, but it doesn't matter because I have a 3 up, bothered by 4 up, or, In other words, there's a lot of morale mitigation in Age of Fantasy with standards and just characters. Even the -1 morale, it's not worth it. Maybe the -200 rear charge, but it's just so rare that you get rear charge. There were times we would try the +1 AP, still wasn't enough. When you're playing with big units that are 40 models, for instance, or 20 models, the game can really slow down. And one of the things that by doubling, especially doubling on the flank or tripling on the rear, but doubling on the flank is a lot more common, you can really pick up these units a lot quicker. So we liked it. Like I said, and I would say this, we've tried other options. We really like doubling, like I said, doubling and tripling attacks. All right, so that's a lot of the core rules that we've covered. We really like this version of the game. Test it out and try it. We're going to be continuing to tweak things. And just so you know, we're not rules lawyers here, so I know that maybe we could word things better. Like I said, none of us are rules experts here, so that's something that we may be working on as well. We do have some corner cases, and this is a divergence from Age of Fantasy Regiments where we don't like ambush, and I'm going to go into what we did for ambush. So ambush in Age of Fantasy Regiments, we don't like it. We don't feel it fits in with the game. Now that's our own personal preference. If you want to play with ambush rules, play with them. What we have found is some simple solutions. One, what we do is we treat all ambush units as scout. So we say, you know what, if you're playing ambush, we don't want you to basically lose that. And since scout and ambush are the same points, we just say, hey, any ambush units in your army, they just have scout now. Now, we did have a corner case where we changed. Now, I would say this. We don't like the army-wide scout and ambush for daemon rule, but we do say this. That you know what, for daemons, because you're paying a little more points for your ambush and scout, we do say basically everyone deploys as a scout, and what we say is armies comprised of all models with this rule basically receive 20 bonus points. So we actually did the calculations, and it turns out it's basically for every 1,000 points, there's basically 20 points that you'd be overspending on daemon. It's slightly more expensive than scout and ambush. So what we do is we just say, hey, with daemons, for every 1,000 points you play, you get 20 extra points. So for a full daemon army, it would be 3,060 points. Now I would say this: we haven't actually, neither of us play daemons, and one of the things that we would love to see is. We would actually love to see in Age of Fantasy Regiments that daemons just lose the daemon rule. For us, traditional rank and flank player, we just don't like it. We also changed surprise attack so that for now, again, it's going to function like scout, but instead of a 12-inch basically position, afterwards you get a 20-inch position. And then after being placed, you roll X dice. Basically, it's the same thing, except basically. So in this surprise attack, you get to go basically 20 inches forward. You get to be right in front of the enemy, and then you get to immediately roll 2 dice within 6 inches and hit some units. And actually, we say this can cause a morale check. So this, like I said, surprise attack is getting a nerf. One of the things, again, that it's one of those things that we don't think rules like surprise attack should even be in this game. But if you're going to play them, we have an alternative version of what you can do for surprise attack. What I would suggest, and what we suggest here is that if you're going to play, especially units like surprise attack, maybe use the custom army builder to build them with scout, or to just, and if you're going to play daemons, we would say maybe use a daemon book that doesn't, have the daemon rule. So, like I said, this game isn't for everybody, and we are not trying to, neither one of us are daemon players. We like to play Age of Fantasy Regiments more traditionally, like Warhammer 8th Edition. That's a lot of our things come from Warhammer 8th Edition, with a little bit coming from Kings of War. All right, so let's go to the last part. This is just about heroes. So one thing we talk about here is that heroes with up to 6 tough 6 may deploy as part of a unit. A hero, this is the same thing. The big things we say is this. We don't want heroes taking up space. So what we say is that heroes basically take the place of one model in the front ranks. I don't know why that's happening. They always share the face of the unit they're in.
And it may move. The other thing we say is that to catch any corner cases, a hero can move to any position on the front rank to attack enemies in its front arc. So it's basically the hero is in the front rank. It's sort of like the old Warhammer make way, where you can basically move the hero and make way. So if it wants to attack a unit over on its left, it can, or here. The other thing we just say is that, hey, you actually don't even have to, we actually say, hey, you don't even need to even use the hero to be the hero doesn't need to be physically there. But basically we say, in other words, a hero can maybe be some sort of representational unit beside it or on top of it. The idea is that as long as your opponent knows where the hero is and it's clearly shown to the opponent, you don't actually even have to have the hero model. The hero model never adds extra space to the unit and can be considered part of any front rank at any time for shooting or anything. They always say is a hero's tough value is added to the total number of wounds for morale purposes. So this is a slight tweak where we do give a bump to heroes. Basically, we want them to be a little more inspiring to the unit. So we allow, in our version, which is a little different than current OPR rules, we do actually allow the hero to get his tough medals. Let's just look at that real fast in Universal Battles. So again, here on the Universal Battles here, and again, we've got these Peg Knights here. What I'm just going to do is I'm just going to go, so the way it would work here, suppose you had a hero and he was on a Pegasus. So you could actually just put this hero right here. And so now you're just moving that hero as a group. And again, we understand that this basically means the hero is going to get attacks as well. What we didn't like in the current Age of Fantasy regiments is that we don't like putting the hero and actually the hero being actual space. We have found that causes a lot of issues. So for us, we just simplify it. A hero is in a unit. It can be, can move around here. Same thing. So you have these cavalry unit. The hero can be there. The other thing is that if you want to, you could actually have the hero maybe as a separate counter, like here. So as you're moving around, you're just have a hero counter. So these guys charge here, and then you just say, oh yeah, this hero is with them and he's attacking with them. But the hero doesn't actually take up any space. But the easiest way to do it is to do here, where you just put the hero in the front rank, and then he just, and again, the front rank attacks with full attacks. We understand that this is a simplification, but it just, for us, it makes the game cleaner. We don't like having heroes stuck on the side of units. It just causes a lot of problems. So for us, that's how we rule it. In other words, that's how we play the game. We found it to be much simpler. We understand that it's not as precise, but it just for us, it's about the game. So anyway, that's sort of our take on heroes. All right, well, I have covered everything in here. I'm going to be posting a link in the description to this. Hey, if you take this, tweak it further, hey, if this helps you enjoy regiments a little more, great. We do admit that we, especially me and Sam, the other co-creator in this, we built this. We want Age of Fantasy regiments to play a lot more like I would say traditional Warhammer regiment. So that's our flavor that we take on this. If that's not your thing, hey, that's no worries. We have found that this game does work. The only caveat that we say in this game that we would suggest is we would suggest actually moving up to 5 rounds. So in here, I didn't change that in the mission. What we do suggest is that we highly suggest for, especially at these larger points at 4,000, that you actually do play 5 rounds minimum, maybe 6. We found that 5 rounds is actually the sweet spot. So that's the one little additional tweak that we would make is 4 rounds in these rules, especially since we've limited movement. That extra round is really going to help you. Hey, thanks a lot. I hope this helps. Anyway, thanks a lot. And I'm going to be trying to put together some regiments battle reports soon. Thanks a lot.